Hello and welcome to the Tech for Climate podcast. I'm Guillaume, your host, and each week I'm fortunate to share with you stories from climate tech founders, investors, and corporations sharing their unique insights into this fast-moving industry. Eventually, like me, you will learn, discover, and get inspired by those unique men and women who are contributing to the fight against climate change, and I hope it will help you to take a step in this formidable movement. So before we start, I just want to share a few words about us, as this podcast is just the tip of the iceberg of what we do at Startup Basecamp to support the climate tech movement. Our mission is to accelerate capital deployment towards climate tech founders, allowing them to focus on scaling their solutions. How do we do that? Every day, we help founders access to resources and connection and gain the visibility they need to expand their growth. We do this in a number of ways with a membership platform, a Slack group with a growing number of founders, investors, and experts from around the world. And recently, we went one step further with the matching services to connect founders with top climate tech investors. Keep in mind that we are able to do all of this thanks to the support of our listeners and our members. So please like and subscribe, share one episode with a friend, join a community, and if you haven't already done so, make a small donation to support our work. It really means the world to us. And now, enjoy the show! Hi everyone! In today's episode, we are speaking with Alex Laplaza, partner at Lowercarbon Capital. Lowercarbon Capital is a seed and early stage fund investing in technologies and solutions to dramatically reduce and remove greenhouse gas emissions. They aim to be the first money in and remain investing in the company for its full life cycle. Alex was born in Spain but grew up in New York. After studying international relations, he found himself spending a summer working in a school in rural Uganda, and describes how he first experienced the magic of environmental solutions being implemented with the installation of a water well, meaning increased school attendance of young girls. He went on to continue working on water security issues as a Fulbright scholar in Indonesia before studying energy policy at Stanford, which eventually led him to work at Lowercarbon Capital. In today's episode, we discuss scaling adaptation solutions and the green vortex, positive feedback loop between policy and technology, and how policies can make the cost of technologies cheaper and vice versa. Alex also gives his take on what the most promising sectors are for building impactful companies at scale whilst being highly profitable. In the second part of the show, Alex tells us how he switches off to find a healthy work-life balance. He also shares his go-to podcasts and books, and also tells us his tips for catching the attention of climate tech investors. Alex, welcome to the show. Hi, Alex. Welcome to the Tech for Climate podcast. I'm super happy to have you here with us today. I'm looking forward to this great opportunity to hear your story and get up to speed on what you guys are looking at with Lowercarbon Capital, which backs kick-ass companies that make real money slashing CO2, sucking carbon out of the sky, and buying us time to unfeed the planet. So welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Excited.
So that's the tradition on the show. Before we start, could you please give us a 30-second introduction about Lowercarbon Capital?
Happy to. Yeah, Lowercarbon Capital is a seed and early stage fund. We aim to be the first money in, and we aim to keep investing for the life cycle of the company. And the thesis is pretty straightforward. It's in the name. We invest in technologies and solutions to dramatically reduce and remove greenhouse gas emissions, as well as buy more time for communities and ecosystems to adapt.
So let's start from the top. In this show, we like to know more a little bit about the human behind the role, behind the responsibility. So can you tell us a bit more about your personal story and background? I mean, what are you passionate about? What do you do besides funding and supporting and investing in exciting founders? I mean, what makes you feel inspired and like your best self? As I always ask, like, who is Alex?
Yeah, so I was born in Spain and to an American mother and a Spanish father. Grew up mostly in New York, and certainly that biculturalism really had an impact on my outlook and what I wanted to do with my life. And both of my parents worked in the medical field, specifically working with children with severe physical disabilities. So service of others was kind of baked in, I would say, since early age. And obviously, when those two components combine, naturally, as a bright-eyed 18-year-old, you go off and study international relations. So that's what I did. I originally thought I was going to work in the field of international development. I spent a summer working in Uganda. I was alone. I don't know how they sent me out there as a 19-year-old out there in the middle of 20 miles to the nearest paved road in the middle of rural Uganda. But I was working at a school, and that's where I really got the first taste of kind of the nexus between development and human security and well-being and the environment. Because I was working at this school, and I saw pretty clearly that the impacts that droughts and unpredictable rains were having on these agricultural communities, and really realizing, that these are the most vulnerable people. These people had the least role in the climate challenge. I think electricity was very, very hard to come by in that area. And yet they were getting hit the hardest. And at the same time, I kind of saw the flip side of, the magic of when environmental solutions are implemented. We were at the school, and I was part of getting a water well installed right at the school. And pretty quickly, it led to record rates of school attendance, particularly of young girls, because they no longer had to spend hours every day going to fetch water for their families. And so from there, that led me to work on issues of water security in Indonesia as a Fulbright scholar. Indonesia, I had a bunch of eloquent reasons in my application why Indonesia, but the truth is I was just a big fan of Anthony Bourdain, and he's a real romantic about Southeast Asia, and so it really got me hooked. And I was working on a little island next to Bali called Lombok, a rural island, a volcanic one, where rivers stream down from the volcano in the center, and they were having issues of water insecurity because people on the volcano were chopping down the forest for fuel. And so it became obvious, like, okay, it's water security insecurity, but really it's an issue of energy access. If they had access to electricity or to other forms of energy, they wouldn't need to cut down their forests. And if they had their forests, they wouldn't be dealing with, flooding in the rainy season and drought in the dry season. So realized energy access was kind of the main game that I wanted to learn. I went to Stanford to do so. And while working on energy policy there, it's hard to go to Stanford and not get captivated by all the people working on cool solutions all around you while you're reading and writing things that people will probably never care about. And so that's where I got my first taste. That's where I first started getting involved in what we call climate tech today. And that's what led me to Lower Carbon.
Fantastic. So maybe that's a good segue here. I like to get a little bit like you already covered this journey that you had so far, traveling different locations in the world. I mean, can you maybe recall one or two pieces of experience that in a way gave you an edge to join Lowercarbon Capital later on, and now today be a partner?
Yeah, I should say I actually first heard about Lowercarbon on a podcast, funny enough. So if you're out there listening to the podcast, it's you never know where podcasts can lead you. The 1 to 2 pieces I would say above all was probably curiosity. I mean, at Stanford's just this playground of opportunities. You can run around and explore any curiosity you had. And I think I really struggled at the time to find one path that I wanted to stick with, because climate tech was evolving so rapidly. There's so many components of it. It's so wide and deep that the opportunity cost of picking any which sector or tech to focus on felt so high. So I just started, going around and exploring a lot of them. I worked on cement decarbonization, electrification of mobility in East Africa, on carbon removal, on chemicals. And it turns out a lot of the companies, the startups that I was studying in this space, unbeknownst to me, happened to be in Lowercarbon's portfolio. Just coincidentally. And so I think it helped quite a bit in my interview process that I knew that I had done in-depth research on their portfolio without their portfolio having been public at the time. So that was somewhat lucky. It was, I guess, just curiosity led me there, if I had to say anything. And maybe the second thing is the through line between all the spaces that I studied were, I would say, the solution sets were somewhat unreasonably ambitious. It was solutions and technologies that has no shortage of skeptics. Things like carbon removal and cement decarbonization. These are really hard solution sets, but those that I thought could really move the needle on greenhouse gas emissions. And I think fortunately, Lowercarbon felt the same way and kind of shared that same ethos. So yeah, curiosity and unreasonably ambitious ideas, I would say.
So thank you so much for sharing that. Just to reflect on you as a person before diving into more like the industry context that we'll cover today. You already mentioned this journey again, but would you recall like any aha moment in terms of why to jump into more like this climate tech industry as of today, and in a way this like progression? Any particular moment where you would define as like, that was like the moment where I said, instead of going to the finance world or maybe consulting or whatsoever, I really want to put all of my sweat and effort, as you do today, to help solving this problem?
Yeah, there's probably a few moments. Certainly the one with the water well was probably one. My experiences in Indonesia, I would say there was one experience in particular I had in Indonesia where I had hiked a volcano. It was an active volcano, so it's got all these fumes coming out of it. And you get to the top, and because it's an active volcano, it's just rumbling so hard that it viscerally shakes you. It really shakes you to your core. And at the time, I was reading about geoengineering. One of the probably the most controversial fields in climate and just means of using technology to combat climate change. And volcanoes are the natural analog for geoengineering, because when volcanoes erupt, they eject sulfur emissions into the stratosphere and reflect sunlight, effectively cooling the planet. And so, standing on that rim of the volcano, I realized, wow, humans have the potential to mimic this power, that was quite literally shaking me. And not only do we have the power to do that now, but we've been doing that. And so that kind of imposed on me the weight of technologies, or specifically climate technologies, and kind of where at that moment I would say is where I knew I wanted to focus on climate technologies as one of the most powerful levers. The other thing I'd say is, and this is less of an aha moment, but more a gradual realization at Stanford, is, as I said, I was working on policy there. I was doing a master's degree in international policy, and I started learning a lot about what some people call, I've heard it referred to as the green vortex, or, it's like this positive feedback loop between policy and technology, whereby policies can make the cost of technologies cheaper, and in effect, technologies can make the cost of policy cheaper. I think specifically a good example is, policies in Europe that made the cost of solar power and wind power cheaper. By reducing those costs and making the cost of renewable energy cheaper, it's easier for policy makers to then be more ambitious and have lower political costs of ramping up climate ambitions. And so that was one realization that I really wanted to tap that virtuous feedback loop, and in doing so, I thought the technology side of that cycle would be a little more fun, at least in the early days, and that's kind of what led me to work on the tech side.
So now let's take a zoom out and a step back at the state of climate adaptation as a sector. I mean, it's challenges and opportunity. I mean, why does it matter in the context of the fight against climate change today? And we'll try to go deeper with you today. Maybe we can start. You can start by giving to the audience your overview of the current situation and upcoming trends. I mean, we hear those heat waves, food stock scarcity, like water scarcity, flood, desertification, and you name it. I mean, what is the magnitude of the problem? Where adaptation is and will be even more necessary in the future? If you can, share some data points about those different, challenges that you see already happening today.
Happy to. Yeah, I mean, the backdrop here is, as we're recording this, I'm sitting in New York City with what is currently the worst air quality in the world because we're being choked by wildfires hundreds of miles away in Canada, and so it's quite literal at the moment. I would say adaptation, to date, has largely been viewed as an issue for governments or infrastructure to solve. But from where I sit, I think there's a lot of opportunities for climate tech and for venture and for markets to scale adaptation solutions. The need, I think, is threefold. There's three big reasons I think about it. The first and the most obvious is, we're already at 1.2 degrees Celsius today. We're fast on our way to shooting past 2 degrees Celsius. And even at where we're at today, there's, untold human and environmental catastrophes happening. It's literally becoming too hot to live in parts of the world. If you've never heard about wet bulb temperatures, the point at which it's too hot and humid for humans to literally be outside and sweat and naturally cool down. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but we're seeing this happen today. And so even if we zeroed out emissions tomorrow, we would still have to deal with the really catastrophic environmental impacts that are starting to ripple out across the planet. Second thing I'd say is because it's precisely because it's already causing problems, it's already an issue that is here today and not far off into the future. There are, in particular, economic effects and challenges like the closing of factories, the choking of supply chains, and more generally just erasing GDP off the map. That creates opportunities for markets to step in and scale solutions more generally. I think, to give you a data point, I think Bank of America put out a report estimating that climate adaptation market is worth $2 trillion a year. An important caveat I'd say is the more we adapt now, the less costly it will be in the future. And then third, and perhaps most importantly, and this is what I believe most strongly, and I think and not everyone agrees with, but contrary to what has long been a commonly held belief, that there is sort of this zero-sum trade-off between investing in mitigation and investing in adaptation. I actually see plenty of ways in which adaptation is decarbonization. For example, efficient air conditioning not only cuts heat deaths, it also cuts CO2 emissions. Wildfire management reduces wildfire destruction and impacts, and methane emissions. Using land for food production rather than fuel or animal feed reduces food insecurity and nitrous oxide emissions. So there's a lot of ways in which adaptation is actually decarbonization. But all that being said, there's an important caveat, and that's that the reverse is also true. If we don't adapt, climate impacts could overwhelm any capability we have to decarbonize. We're already seeing places like in China, when rivers dry up, you can no longer manufacture solar panels, EVs, batteries. Extreme heat in Europe last summer closed hydropower plants and nuclear power plants, only to be replaced by gas generation. And all over the world, when heat waves push electricity grids to the brink, markets respond often by scrambling for coal power and coal generation. So not only is adaptation decarbonization, but the failure to adapt will make decarbonization harder.
So to go a little bit deeper on the understanding and prior going to more like, what are the existing solution, and after that, what are the upcoming solution that you see in terms of adaptation. We understand like this is definitely a tremendous challenges and represent, so could you maybe share with us like, are we all equal regarding those effects? We often hear like the South in all the southern hemisphere is like paying the harder price. Is it still true today? You mentioned like the air quality now in New York. So do you see like any balance there? Who will you think like in the near future pay also the hard price? And maybe double clicking on what you already started to mention, but like what are the indirect and non-obvious consequences at the human and economical level that you have identified that if adaptation is not in place, we will suffer from?
Yeah, to answer the first question, everyone on the planet will be impacted by climate change. I think that's not a controversial statement to say. Everyone already is being impacted in one form or another. The fact that I'm inside while the New York City has terrible air quality because of wildfires hundreds of miles away is, I think, a clear evidence of that. But that being said, it's without a doubt the communities and the ecosystems or the communities that have had the lowest or the smallest role in contributing to the problem are those most vulnerable. Not only are they often in places that will feel the impacts the hardest, in particular, I'm thinking about areas of the world that will see the highest, the hardest heat waves that also happen to coincide with very large population centers. I'm thinking South and Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera. They will see disproportionate impacts despite having a disproportionately low share of CO2 emissions. But I think more importantly, their ability to withstand these impacts are just going to be far lower, and their ability to recover from them will be far lower. I think if you look at what happened in Pakistan last year with the flooding that submerged about a third of the country and produced like 30 million climate refugees in the course of a week, essentially. That will have impacts on the country for years. Whereas a hurricane that hits in the United States, our ability to withstand and then recover is clearly much different. So that's what I'd say on the first question. In terms of impacts in ways that are maybe less thought about, it's hard to say because the climate impacts will be so foundational to modern society and our global economy. And by that I mean, food and water insecurity are kind of the base of the pyramid, and just physical security in terms of natural disasters. These will shake and erode the foundations of global economic stability with effects that will ripple out in ways that will be really, really hard to predict. But quite scary. And I think all this points to the need for adaptation today because of what I said earlier. The more you adapt today, the more you build in resilience beforehand, the easier it will be to withstand and recover in the future.
So now that we get a better understanding of this very dark, dark backdrop that we have here, let's maybe speak a little bit about already alternatives and solution in place today. Maybe if you can pick a few of the most impactful, that you have seen, and who is already, putting them in place? How is that market already organized? And then after that, the following question will be more about what do you see in terms of innovation and need for innovation there? So maybe let's start with what we have today here.
Sure. Well, the most obvious space and need for solutions is heat, because climate change is simply a challenge of too much heat. More greenhouse gas means more heat means more extreme weather. And so I think at a kind of a more fundamental level, we're getting to the point where it gets so hot that it affects the ability for humans to just live and survive. And so air conditioning is an obvious one that, you know, many folks don't often think of as climate adaptation, but it certainly is. It's a solution that is existing today. There's been studies that says the rise of air conditioning in the U.S. in the 20th century actually cut deaths from extreme heat by 75%. So pretty remarkable solution that we know is already working. We know air conditioning is going to boom as the world gets hotter, as the world develops and grows wealthier. And so that's already a solution that we need to ensure gets widely deployed. But we also need to ensure is we improve and make it far more high efficiency, use refrigerants that are lower global warming potential, can deal with humidity because it's going to be most important in markets like India, Brazil, Indonesia, places that are going to be hot and humid. So that's one obvious today. I think along those lines, cold chain is going to be more and more important. Cold chain is kind of the unspoken one of the unspoken backbones of the global economy that can take ice cream from cow to cone or vaccine for that matter from labs to jabs. And so cold chain is going to be more and more important to ensure that the food doesn't go wasted, that we have medicines to provide. It's not an obvious one today, but I think it's only going to grow more in importance. And then for the other areas, I would say generally I think of the solutions that exist today in a few buckets. Heat is being one of them, but the others being food security, water security, and then just general physical security. Resilience to disasters. And there's a whole number of solutions within each of them. I think the one that is probably the most obvious in terms of the role it plays today and the role it will need to play in the future and evolve is in insurance or insurtech, or a lot of folks, insurance is kind of this just kind of a more boring, fact of life. It's just and I think insurance is kind of the $6 trillion safety net under the global economy that is going to grow more and more important as a means, both as a signal of where and where not to build, but as we're seeing in California today, as insurers pull out of certain wildfire-prone areas, but also just the ability to cost effectively transfer and pool risks and get capital to people who need it after disaster strikes. So these are solutions that are not always super technologically advanced. They're existing today, but I think are certainly an adaptation and certainly only going to grow in importance.
So let's speak now a little bit about the future of adaptation and emerging alternatives to traditional solutions that you see maybe that is being developed in labs or like still very early stage. If you could maybe like pinpoint a few upcoming innovation with their potential and weaknesses or challenge at this stage that you have identified, and which one are the most promising or advanced for you? No need to name anyone. We don't want to, create any favoritism here, but more about like just having an understanding of what is coming on that sense.
Sure. The space I've been thinking a lot about recently is controlled environment agriculture. And, this is kind of an umbrella term to include everything from the low tech greenhouse to the vertical farm. Specifically, I'm interested not in the vertical farms because I think there's always going to be challenges with the energy use and the energy efficiency of those, certainly relative to field agriculture, because, it turns out it's hard to compete with the sun. But just advanced greenhouses as a means to grow produce far more efficiently. We're seeing in the Netherlands in particular, as the world leader in advanced greenhouse agriculture, they can produce 10x the yield of field agriculture with something like 85% the water and the fertilizer use. And I think this is only going to grow more important because as climate instability wreaks havoc on weather patterns and agriculture or outdoor agriculture, I think more and more of it will move inside. There's also the tailwinds of nearshoring of supply chains, and more generally, this is there's so much data in these warehouses, or in these greenhouses rather, that it becomes a really exciting opportunity for things like AI to automate and to optimize, for us to really maximize food production while minimizing the inputs. That's one area I'm excited about. Another one in the food security space is I work a lot on cellular agriculture, just producing products and goods using synthetic biology. In particular, cells to produce things like meat, cheese, coffee, milks, really many products that are very greenhouse intensive today, but that can actually be replicated, biologically speaking, exactly the same, just using cells. One area here that I think is going to be important is actually feeding the cells. Microbes also got to eat. And so finding ways that we can feed cells their inputs, their sugars, without significant land use implications, like cutting down forests to grow sugar to make lab grown meat is not going to be a good solution. So ways of reducing the impacts of kind of future food technologies is an interesting space. And then one that's emerging, actually, that has been pretty low tech to date, and I think we're living with the consequences right now, is wildfire management. A forest's best friends, paradoxically, are actually fires and axes. So ways of scaling, using technology to scale forest management by scaling, quote unquote, good fire, prescribed burns, or forest thinning, to make it far more scalable than what we do today, which is largely manual labor and people on hand, and on foot. There's a lot of really exciting opportunities there that I think have significant implications for our resilience, but also climate emissions. As I said, the more you can handle wildfires, the fewer emissions we'll have as well.
So taking a macro approach and stepping back for a bit, could you tell us, according to you, what are the US advantages and weaknesses in regard of innovation and production that will lead to a world that can be fully equipped for adaptation? How do you compare maybe US versus China in the EU?
It's an interesting question. I would say, from a macro level, the United States has the advantage in that it's quite a dynamic and diverse economy. And so this has significant advantages in the realm of climate adaptation because, it is more resilient in some respects to certain climate impacts than maybe some other economies. Let's say, for example, economy that is highly dependent on one commodity crop makes up a big share of their GDP, and if they lose that, then it puts significant risk to the entire economy. The US has fewer points of failure like that in terms of climate impacts. So that's one benefit. And the second of it being dynamic and diverse is that there are a wider range of areas and solution sets in which to work on and build and develop and scale technologies. And so from that perspective, in terms of playing a role globally in exporting, so to speak, climate adaptation technologies, I think it has a natural advantage there. And lastly, I'd say, I spent a lot of time in my current role at Lowercarbon as an investor. I spent a lot of time working in emerging markets, working in other economies, looking for solutions and technologies in markets like Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia. And something that the US, I think, boasts as a natural advantage is just the technical talent of people working in these spaces, people coming out of world-class labs with PhDs focused on climate mitigation and adaptation. And so that's certainly probably the biggest advantage I would say the US has compared to some of these markets.
So to close this section before diving into lower carbon capital, I mean, what are the major like constraints that you have identified for adaptation? I mean, do you see any major roadblocks? Is the need of like new policies to be put in place, like of international coordination or funding? I mean, what needs to happen to accelerate the movement and have a world fully equipped at best to adapt? And in which timeline do you think, or it sounds realistic to you?
I would say the number one barrier is what I alluded to before. It's this kind of mentality that is zero-sum thinking that adaptation and mitigation are trade-offs, that if you invest in dollars into mitigation or into adaptation, rather, it's money that could otherwise go into mitigation. And as I shared earlier, I think that's just kind of a false dichotomy, because I think they're in many ways really synergistic and synonymous. And so that thinking has held back adaptation and investments and development of adaptation solutions for decades at this point. It's certainly starting to shift, but today we still see, I think, something like 7% of all climate funding going to adaptation, the rest going into carbon reduction or removal. So part of it is just more dollars, and I would say, kind of at another level, the idea that adaptation is something for the future has also been a constraint rather. The fact that folks think, yeah, we can just invest in adaptation when the climate impacts are come around. As we know, they're here today, and then lastly, that it is the role of governments to solve. And certainly it's true, the governments need to play a massive role in adaptation, but I think there's an exciting role for markets and private markets to scale solutions, as I was explaining earlier.
So let's go into the specific of lower carbon capital. I mean, can you tell us a bit more about the story, the genesis of it? I mean, what was the initial gap seen by Chris and Crystal that led to the thesis behind it?
So Lowercarbon was born out of Lowercase Capital, which was started by Chris and Crystal Sacca. And Lowercase Capital was one of the most successful venture funds of all time. It had a portfolio that included Uber, Twitter, Instagram, Stripe, Docker. And Chris and Crystal decided to step away from Lowercase to focus on some passion areas like criminal justice reform and rebuilding the democratic tech stack and climate, but more from a philanthropic perspective. And in doing so, they got to meet climate companies. They got into the labs. They met activists. They met policymakers, and they recognized that there was a fundamental shift in technology since Clean Tech 1.0, where we were earlier on the line in which the unit economics just didn't pencil out, but the line was fundamentally a curved line. There was exponential growth powered by things like advanced computing and machine learning and synthetic biology. In the point that we were at, this is around 2017, 2018, we were starting to see solutions that were clean, but just made sense, right? They were just cheaper, they were faster, they were stronger, they were just plain better than existing solutions, in large part because renewable power was just cheaper than any form of fossil energy today. Digging up and burning fossil fuels is actually quite expensive, all things considered. So they realized that's where we were, and that their solution set, their skill set and expertise of scaling and building companies was really valuable to a lot of these climate solutions. VCs love big addressable markets, and the addressable markets for climate tech are the 8 billion people in the world who eat food and flick on light switches and live in homes and use any form of transportation. So I think there was this realization that we can't rely on these 8 billion people to buy climate technologies out of the goodness of their heart or their love for the planet. We just need them to buy it out of self-interest. And because we are starting to see the curve lines made it such that things were the self-interest was there. I think that's where they decided to go more meaningfully and launch lower carbon.
So we always hear that, and it was maybe true more like a year ago that capital was a commodities, and that founders were looking also what are the other offers or service that a firm can offer to me when they invest in my company. So what are like besides this capital, and you guys also quite well known, which is this reputation is definitely helping other founders in their cap table, but what are the extra, I would say, service and support that you offer to those founders, and that in a way are solving or helping to solve the challenges that are inherent to their early stage venture?
Generally speaking, I'd say the number one thing is that we are climate heads, first and foremost. Most of the team at this point were all folks that were working in climate that had all dedicated their lives and careers to working on climate and came across venture capital as a means to scale climate solutions. And so, we've all been we're all folks that have been deep in the space for years at this point. And the way that lends itself to value to our portfolio companies more concretely is, we're the type of people that will go cell by cell on your techno-economic analysis. It will introduce you to all the relevant government agencies and policymakers that will move the needle for you. Typically venture capital is often shied away from engagement with government, and with climate, there's no choice. And in fact, it's quite an advantage when you have those relationships. And more generally, this is a deeply emotional space to build in, right? It's a space where you're constantly thinking about existential risks, and it's hard. And, we can empathize with that very deeply. And I think that goes a long way and kind of is embedded in all the work we do for our founders.
So besides adaptation, as we covered already, I mean, which are the sectors are, according to you, the most promising for you today in terms of what I call the ICR or impact cash return, meaning building impactful companies at scale that can be also highly profitable business? Any underdogs or subsectors, areas that you didn't mention so far that you're excited about?
Yeah, going back to the thesis I kind of laid out, that was one of the motivations to start Lower Carbon. We get really excited when we see companies building solutions for existing markets that are just better, are cheaper, faster, stronger, in particular for the largest markets like cement and steel and chemicals and aviation, what some people call the hard to abate sectors. Because self-interest scales, if you can provide a solution that is kind of a substitute good, the demand curve, and that folks will buy it because it's drop-in, but it's cheaper. That's where you can get you can get to scale really quickly, but also see significant climate impact as a result. And so we're always looking for those really big markets that can really move the needle on greenhouse gas emissions. And to be clear, while we always look for impact, we think scale leads to impact, not the other way around. So we're always looking for companies that just can exist in their own right, just on the fundamentals of the business, on their unit economics, not relying on folks on behavior change, on folks to feel good about using the products. So we're always looking at solutions like that. I would say, in addition to the ones I just mentioned, heavy industry, a place where this is particularly true, where self-interest is the most important part, is emerging markets. We look for a lot of opportunities in places like India and Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, where things like renewable energy is just cheaper, and so folks are going to buy it not because they care or even should care about the planet, but because it's just the cheapest form of energy. I should say we also do quite a bit of work in carbon removal, have a dedicated fund for carbon removal, and as well as a dedicated fund for nuclear fusion. These are two spaces that the markets, contrary to everything I just said about existing markets and solutions that are pure substitute goods, these are markets that don't exist today, but we think will be massive in the decades ahead. And so we are playing quite a bit of role in getting those markets off the ground and shaping them early on.
So taking the opposite side, I mean, what do you believe that makes no sense whatsoever out of the pitch or sectors that you listened or explore right now? I mean, that could be like even considered as like waste of time or resource or even greenwashing. I mean, do you have any examples of like sectors that fortunately doesn't spike your interest?
Mm-hmm. Um, the number one that comes to mind is probably hydrogen. To be clear, I think hydrogen has a significant role to play in a number of sectors, just not every sector. I kind of view hydrogen as the skeleton key of decarbonization because it really can unlock so many doors. It's quite a versatile technology, if you will. But that doesn't mean you should use it on every door, right? There's certain sectors it works for, certain sectors it won't. In particular, when we look at hydrogen, we kind of like to focus on the ones that already have existing hydrogen demand, things like chemicals and refining, things that we know the demand is there and is dirty today. And so decarbonizing could make quite an impact. Other things like light duty vehicles, maybe even medium and heavy duty vehicles, a little bit more questionable, but that's one thing I'd say. And I say this in particular because there's a lot of private funding. There's a lot of public funding going into this for reasons we can get into. But that's one I'd say is probably disproportionate in terms of the attention versus the impact. On a personal level, maybe it's just because I'm a climate guy and not a VC, or at least a climate guy first and a VC second. It's hard for me to get excited about like climate SaaS and verticalized climate software. I recognize there's immense potential and a big role for softwares to play. It's just harder for me to get excited when we're talking about, when I'm spending most of my day thinking about decarbonizing cement and steel and chemicals, and so software it feels a little less exciting to me personally.
That's interesting because collaborating with a lot of like climate tech funds, it's true that some of them more like have more appetite for like the software solution of the spectrum and like climate solution enabled by software. So maybe that would be interesting to understand your opinion on like, I mean, up to where into the development of a company capex, like you will finance capex and support companies that are capex heavy, which often climate hardware solution is requiring for. So what's the threshold there? Where is like I would say like this red line that unfortunately you won't be crossing as a venture fund?
There's no hard and fast rules. We wouldn't be in this business, and Lowercarbon wouldn't exist if we were unwilling to finance, to invest in deep tech and hardware companies. I think it's pretty core to our ethos, just because of recognition that reducing greenhouse gas emissions at scale will take steel in the ground, will take massive building. That doesn't mean that all should come from equity dollars by any means, but no hard and fast line. What I think I'd say is these solutions are easier to finance than maybe a lot of people anticipate. In large part because of what I said earlier, the demand curves are known, the substitute goods, we understand how what people will do with them, what prices they'll pay with them. That makes it easier for things like project finance and debt. And so while we might not be the ones providing that project finance and debt because we're a venture capital fund, we know the right players to get in touch with and at the right times. So no hard and fast rules, but generally I'd say is we have an appetite for deep tech and hardware solutions at the earliest stages.
So a couple of more questions for this first part of the interview. How do you guys measure impact? I mean, in comparison to other funds, sometimes there's no like threshold in terms of CO2 removed or avoid or abate. I mean, do you have any specific process frameworks? I mean, you mentioned you are a climate guy first and a VC second. So I guess you are part of the scientist team. But do you have like external scientists and teams that you rely on to assess projects that you will invest? I mean, how does it work on that sense?
Mm-hmm. This is another example. It's case by case. We've thought about this very deeply, in particular, thinking about is it possible to have a uniform way of measuring impact? And largely the answer is no. Climate is so wide and so deep that it's impossible to have apples to apples comparison across the board, certainly across the portfolio. How do you measure impact in a climate adaptation solution relative to a carbon removal solution? It's just very different. And so what I'd say is we are always looking for scale. We have a team of in-house scientists and experts with deep expertise on things like life cycle assessments and techno-economic analyses that give us perspective on the paths to scale and the impacts at scale. And we take it on a case by case. We evaluate, certainly looking for gigatons, but no hard explicit threshold. Generally, building a startup is hard enough as it is. Often we don't want to burden these companies with with getting too rigorous too early on. We would rather you focus on building the solution and then understanding its impact. So yeah, no hard and fast rules, but we're not trying to burden founders with extreme granularity and accuracy when we know that if it works, it's going to be impactful. That's kind of the high level filter.
That makes sense, especially at the early stage. That spending too much time on trying to have the perfect framework, for founders makes definitely no sense. So what's next for Lowercarbon Capital?
So we've just raised a few new funds. We'll have some announcements shortly, but really just doubling down. We truly believe in this space, and we truly believe in the founders building in it. And so we want to be partners from, as I said, the earliest days to the whole life cycle of the company. And so I think it's just really just doubling down our efforts, trying to move faster, trying to go bigger. It's not getting any cooler. So much of what we've been doing, but just ramping up.
So what's your personal view on the climate crisis? I mean, as I always ask, what would you say to the people who already see and go through the visible consequences of climate change? I mean, are we doomed?
We're not doomed. I would say every fraction of every degree matters, and so it's a worthwhile endeavor to work on it, to dedicate your life to it. It's fulfilling, it's exciting, it's very stimulating. And the other thing I'd say is, the thing that gives me optimism is that with many climate technologies and solutions, the world would be better off with them existing even in a world without climate change. I'll give you a concrete example. As we decarbonize and move away from fossil fuels, that makes sense even if fossil fuels didn't lead to climate change, because we still have millions of people dying every year from air pollution. So climate tech isn't just about working on climate, it's just about making the society as a whole more sustainable and more equitable. And I think that's a really worthwhile endeavor, and it should hopefully encourage folks to put their skills to work. And the second thing I'd say is you really don't need to know much about climate. You don't need to be an expert, and you don't need to be a scientist. There's a role for everyone to play in fighting climate change. So any skill set, any expertise, any will that you have to work in climate is valuable.
So how can the community of founders, experts, investors listening to the show today can help you?
We always love to see ambitious ideas, no matter how early on. If you have an idea, if you want to talk about it, I'm happy to be a sounding board. Always reach out. You can hit me up on LinkedIn, on Twitter. I'm pretty available. So never hesitate to reach out, even if it's just an idea. We always are looking for new partners to get involved in the climate fight.
Any question I should have asked and I did not for this first part of the interview?
I've been hearing a lot of your questions about what you're excited about, what you're not, to all your guests. So I'm kind of curious to flip it around on you.
What do you mean? I'm going to cut this one. What do you
All right,
mean?
let
What
me
do you
think of a
mean?
better one then. I don't know, man.
But we see quite a bit of interesting companies passing through, and I should add you if you're interested on our mailing list that we have. So basically what we have is like every month we curate 4 to 5 companies that are currently fundraising early stage. It can be in different part of the world. And are currently fundraising, and we share that with different funds. And
I would love that.
If funds want to be connected with them, we facilitate the connection, and if not, would be for the next month. You know what I mean?
Awesome. I would love that. Yeah, please do.
Yeah, it's kind of a way for us to, amplify what they do, give them visibility, but through a VC framework. So that's what we are putting in place. Thank you so much, Alex, for your time, your incredible insight on the industry. I'm so excited to see so many brilliant people like you putting so much time and effort to move the ball towards a better and cleaner world. So thank you so much for coming.
It was a lot of fun. Pleasure to be here. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks again for joining us on the Tech for Climate podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show. Stay tuned next week for more climate tech insights. In the meantime, head on over to our webpage at startupbasecamp.org, where we have lots more insights and resources for anyone wanting to get involved in climate tech. If you find our resources useful, please consider donating to support our small self-funded team. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. And see you next time.